You're a hateful man, my daughter-in-law said during Thanksgiving. My name is Harold Davenport. I'm 62 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I hadn't raised my voice in this family in over a decade. That night, my daughter-in-law stood up in the middle of the living room, my living room as it turned out, looked me dead in the eye in front of 14 people, and said, "You're the person everyone hates. How does that feel?" My family had been gathering at that table for 30 years before she ever walked through the door. I didn't shout. I didn't leave. I picked up my glass, set it down on the coffee table, stood up slowly, and asked her one question. One quiet question. And the entire room went still. Before I tell you what I said, and why that single sentence changed everything, you need to understand something. There was a piece of information I had never told a single soul. Not my brother, not my pastor, not even my son. Before we get there, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your location and the time where you're watching from. I always love knowing who's out there listening. Now let me take you back 3 years ago. The week Kyle brought Brittany home for the very first time. I want to be honest about something up front. Every father thinks no one is quite good enough for his child. I knew that about myself. So when Kyle called me on a Tuesday evening, voice bright, nervous, and said he'd met someone, I told myself to keep an open mind. He'd been working at the same tech firm for 4 years by then. She was in project management on the same floor. 8 months of dating, and then one Sunday afternoon, he pulled into my driveway with a woman I'd never seen and introduced her like he was handing me a report he'd already filed. "Dad, this is Brittany." She shook my hand. Firm grip, perfect smile. The kind of smile that's doing a job. I told myself, "Harold, you're projecting." I made dinner. I asked her questions. She answered all of them correctly. The right amount of detail, the right amount of modesty. Kyle watched her the whole evening like a man watching a performance he'd already memorized. 14 months later, they were married. I wasn't consulted on the venue, the date, the guest list, or the catering. Kyle mentioned it once, casually. "Britt's handling the details. She's good at that." And she was. The wedding was flawless. Every centerpiece in its place, every relative seated with surgical precision. I stood at the altar and watched my son's face when she walked toward him. He looked relieved. Not the way a man looks at the woman he loves. The way a man looks when the hard part is finally over. My brother Ray stood beside me. After the reception, walking to the car, he said 2 words. "Tight ship." I nodded. Neither of us said anything else. But I noticed, as we drove away, that Brittany hadn't once looked at Kyle's eyes when she laughed. She'd looked at the room. About 2 months after the wedding, I sat Kyle down at my kitchen table, the same table where his mother and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 22 years, and made him an offer. I owned 2 properties. The house I was living in, which had been in the family since before Kyle was born, and a 3-bedroom place about 25 minutes out in a quiet subdivision off Route 9. I'd bought it the year Kyle started college, thinking I'd use it as a rental. Never got around to it. The tenants I'd imagined never materialized, and the house just sat there, maintained, patient. "You two are just starting out," I said. "Live there. No rent. Not yet. Get on your feet first." Kyle's eyes went red at the edges. He tried to say something and didn't quite manage it. Just nodded. The next day I called Brittany to go over a few things. Where the water shutoff was, which circuit breaker tripped if you ran the dryer and the dishwasher together. "That's very generous, Harold," she said, smooth as glass. I told her the deed was still in my name, just so she knew. It came out matter of fact, the way you'd mention a property tax date. She said, "Of course," and moved on. There was no lease, no formal agreement, just my word and hers, which I now understand is not the same thing. I didn't tell Ray. I didn't tell anyone. That house was worth close to $340,000 at the time, and putting that number between a father and his son felt like the wrong kind of thing to do. Generosity that keeps score isn't generosity. I believed that. I still do. I just understand now that not everyone sees it that way. In the bottom drawer of my desk at home, behind a folder of old utility receipts, was a copy of the deed. Notarized. My name on every line. I forgot about it mostly, until I needed to remember. The first year I told myself I was imagining things. I stopped in on Sundays, the way I always had when Kyle was growing up. Brittany was always there, always pleasant, and always, somehow, in the middle of something. Company coming later, Kyle was napping. She'd just started a load of laundry and things were in disarray. You don't have to call ahead, she told me once, but it does help. So I started calling ahead. Then she started not picking up until I'd left a message. Kyle's birthday that first April. He turned 32. I was looking at my phone on a Saturday afternoon when a photo popped up on his profile. Backyard cookout, paper plates and string lights, and 9 or 10 people I didn't know, plus Ray and Carol. Ray had his arm around Kyle's shoulder. Everyone was laughing. I scrolled through the pictures twice, looking for some evidence that I'd been invited and forgotten to write it down. There wasn't any. Kyle texted me the next morning. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought Britt already texted you." I typed back, "No worries. Looks like a good time." I put the phone face down on the counter and stood at the window for a while. She never called me Dad. I noticed that around month 4. Kyle called Diane Mom Diane. Brittany had set that up within the first few weeks of the marriage. Casual, easy, just the way things were done. But she called me Harold. Always Harold. The name sat in her mouth like a formality. I told myself, she's private. She's still adjusting. Some people take longer to warm up. Kyle texted again that evening. "It won't happen again, Dad. I promise." It happened 4 more times before Thanksgiving. When Brittany told us she was pregnant, I went to a woodworking shop the following weekend and picked out the lumber myself. A white oak crib, simple joints, no shortcuts. Took me 3 weeks. I sanded it by hand and used the same stain my father had used on the furniture in our farmhouse when I was a boy. I delivered it to the house on Route 9 in February, carried it up the stairs in pieces, and assembled it in what was going to be the nursery. Brittany said it was beautiful. Kyle ran his hand along the rail and looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 8 years old and I'd fixed something that had seemed unfixable. That was the best afternoon I'd had in 2 years. The baby came in late April, a boy. Kyle texted me at 11:17 at night. "Baby's here. We'll let you know when you can visit." I read that message 3 times. I told myself it was late, that everyone was tired, that this was how first-time parents communicated at midnight when they were overwhelmed. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and went to bed. I drove to the hospital the next morning, asked at the front desk, found the wing, found the room number. The door was slightly open. I could hear voices. Brittany's mother laughing softly at something, that particular indoor laugh people use when they're performing contentment for an audience. I knocked. Diane Holloway was in the chair by the window, holding the baby. She smiled when she saw me, the satisfied smile of someone who has already taken the best seat and knows it. Brittany looked up from the bed, tired, genuine, and something else underneath. "Harold, we're a little overwhelmed right now." "Of course," I said. "I won't stay long." Kyle was standing near the window. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and was surprised to discover he didn't care. He handed me the baby without waiting to be asked, and for that I was quietly grateful. My grandson weighed 8 pounds and change. He had Kyle's chin and Margaret's coloring. He was asleep and entirely unconcerned with anything happening around him, which struck me as the most sensible position available. I held him for 4 minutes. I know because I counted, not out of resentment, but because I wanted to remember exactly how long it was. The weight of him, the particular warmth. Then Diane stood up from the chair, not urgently, just with the practiced motion of someone reclaiming her rightful position. I handed the baby back to Kyle, put on my coat, and said I'd come again soon. Diane stayed for a week. She was there every day when I called to check in. Sometimes Brittany picked up, sometimes no one did. That evening I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. The car ticked as the engine cooled. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. I kept thinking about Margaret, how she would have walked into that room and rearranged it with her presence alone, made Diane scoot over, made Brittany feel seen and not surveilled. She had that gift. I never learned it properly. Some people carry a room. I mostly just try not to disturb one. I got out of the car, went inside, didn't call anyone. The white oak crib was upstairs in the baby's room. I'd built it well. It would hold him for years. The rewriting started quietly, the way these things always do. A woman from my church mentioned it first. We were in the parking lot after Sunday service, early September, and she tilted her head at me with the careful sympathy of someone delivering unwelcome news she'd been rehearsing. "Harold, I heard Kyle's wife mention you've been having some trouble getting along with the family." I stood there a moment. Did she? She seemed concerned, said you could be, she used the word, intense. I thanked her for telling me and drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a few minutes thinking about the word intense. I'm a retired engineer. I make soup from scratch and go to bed before 10. I haven't raised my voice at anyone in 11 years. Whatever intense meant in Brittany's version of me, it wasn't the man who had been quietly swallowing every discourtesy for 2.5 years and saying nothing because he didn't want to put his son in the middle of something. I gave it 3 days before I brought it up with Kyle. Not in anger, just steadily, the way I'd approach a problem at work that needed honest diagnosis. We sat on my back porch and I asked him plainly if he'd heard Brittany describe me that way to other people. He looked at his hands. She doesn't mean it as a criticism, Dad. You can just be a lot, sometimes. When? I asked. Give me one specific time. He couldn't. We both sat there with that silence between us, which was its own kind of answer. That night, after he left, I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. I didn't plan to. My hand just went there. I took out the copy of the deed, set it flat on the desk under the lamp, read my own name on every line, the address on Route 9, the date I'd paid it off, 11 years ago, 2 months before Margaret got sick, before everything reorganized itself around something I couldn't fix. I sat with the paper for a long time. Then I folded it once and put it back in the drawer. I didn't think of it as a weapon. I want to be clear about that. I thought of it the way you think of a fact you hope you never have to use. The kind that only becomes necessary if someone decides the truth is no longer worth honoring. I put the paper away, but I didn't forget it was there. The Thanksgiving a year before, the one that was supposed to be a fresh start, I drove out to Route 9 with a bottle of wine and whatever remained of my patience. I'd been seated at the far end of the long table, near the baby's travel crib. The baby was asleep, face turned sideways, a small fist resting against his cheek. I spent most of the first course studying the curl of his fingers. The main conversation happened 12 feet away, where Brittany presided the way a department head runs a staff meeting. Agenda set, interruptions managed, outcome predetermined. She was talking about their plans for the following year. A new car for Kyle, a renovation to the back deck. Figures dropped naturally, casually, as though money were simply something that accumulated without effort and required only the right kind of confidence to access. Midway through the meal, she pivoted to what she called our priorities going forward, a phrase that landed with the weight of a prepared statement. Kyle nodded along without looking up from his plate. He'd heard it before, I could tell. The nodding was the automatic kind. I waited for a natural pause and said, "That's a big payment, son. You sure about the timing?" Brittany didn't miss a beat. "We've already decided, Harold. It's our life." The table went quiet. Not the surprise kind of quiet. The kind where everyone has calculated that the safest move is to suddenly find their food very interesting. Kyle looked at his plate. The fork moved through his sweet potato casserole without engaging with it. I watched my son not eat and thought about how different he'd been 2 years earlier, sitting at a different table, full of opinions about everything, including other people's car payments. The man across from me had been carefully reduced into something more manageable, and the reduction had been so gradual, he probably couldn't see it happening to himself. I nodded. I picked up my fork. I ate what was in front of me, helped carry a few dishes to the kitchen, and said my goodbyes at 8 o'clock sharp. Ray walked me to my car. The air outside was cold and clean after the warmth of the house. Frost was starting on the windshields along the block. "Harold," he said. "I know. You going to say something?" I thought about the drawer, about the deed with my name on every line, about the 12 minutes in the maternity ward, and the birthday cookout I'd seen in photographs after the fact, and the woman from church who had said the word intense with the careful sympathy of someone delivering unwelcome news. "1 more year," I said. "I'll give it 1 more year." Ray nodded like a man who understood the reasoning, but wasn't going to pretend he agreed with it. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the heater running. A man can only swallow so much before the meal turns to stone. 6 months before Thanksgiving, Kyle called on a Saturday morning while I was drinking coffee on the back porch. He spent a few minutes on small talk, how the baby was doing, a project at work. Then he shifted gears the way he used to when he was 17 and needed something he wasn't sure he should ask for. "Dad, Britt and I have been talking. We'd love to start building equity. Is there any chance we could buy the house from you?" Below market, obviously. I set my mug down on the porch rail. Whose idea was this? A pause. Too long. We both thought, Kyle. It came up in one of our conversations. She brought it up first, yeah. I told him I'd need time to think. He said, of course, no pressure, take all the time I needed. I could hear her in the background, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. 2 days later, I called a lawyer I'd known for 15 years, a man named Paul Strickland, who'd handled the estate when Margaret died. I laid it all out. He confirmed what I already knew. No lease, no legal claim, no right of tenancy that wouldn't dissolve with proper written notice. The house was mine as clearly as my own name was mine. I didn't tell Kyle about that conversation, but I made a decision. I would not sell. And I called Paul again the following week about my will. The house would go to Kyle, fully, cleanly, but only after I was gone. Brittany's name would not appear on any document while I was alive. It wasn't punitive, it was honest. I knew the difference, even if no one else would. I had built that house into something worth protecting, and I was starting to understand that what needed protecting wasn't the building. I declined Kyle's request on a Tuesday evening, kept it brief. It's not the right time for me, son. No elaboration, no apology. The invitation stopped the following week. Not dramatically, not with a declared embargo, just nothing. The Sunday calls from Kyle got shorter. The house on Route 9 went quiet. For 3 months, I had no reason to drive out there because there was nothing to drive out to. No invitations, no drop-by visits, no texts asking if I wanted to come see the baby. I found myself noticing the absence of my grandson more than the absence of the adults. He was 8 months old by then and had recently discovered that other people's faces were interesting. I'd been at the age when every week is a different child. 3 months of not seeing him felt like missing chapters of a book you're not sure you'll ever finish. Then Kyle called me on a Wednesday in late August. Not from the house, from his cell, which meant he was somewhere Brittany wasn't. Outside, or in his car, or in the parking lot of somewhere that gave him 30 minutes of privacy. Can we meet somewhere, Dad? We sat in the parking lot of the shopping center off Ridgemont Road. His car, engine off, windows cracked in the August heat. He looked like a man who'd been running the same argument through his head for 6 weeks and hadn't won it yet. She's not happy, he said, about the house thing. I just think, if you could talk to her, explain your reasoning. I looked at my son. 33 years old, he had his mother's jawline and her habit of looking slightly to the left when he was saying something that was costing him something. I recognized the posture. He'd used it the first time he brought home a failing grade, and the time he'd borrowed my truck without asking and come back with a dent in the bumper. About what exactly? I asked. What would I be explaining? He opened his mouth and closed it again. There was no good answer to that question, and he knew it. I got out of the car, told him I loved him, said we'd talk more soon. That was the last time I saw him before Thanksgiving. 2 weeks later, a text arrived from Brittany. No greeting, just, "You're welcome to join us for Thanksgiving, 2 p.m. Bring something if you'd like." I read it twice, then I replied, "I'll be there." I meant it, though probably not in the way she expected. Ray called me on a Thursday, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and told me what he'd done. He'd phoned Brittany directly. He didn't ask my permission, because he knew I'd have told him not to. He was polite, he said. He kept his voice even. He told her that he'd watched Harold give them everything, that Harold had never asked for anything in return, and that Harold did not deserve to be treated like a stranger to his own grandchild. I sat in my kitchen chair, listening to my brother report this back to me. "What did she say?" I asked. She said, "Ray, Harold and I have a complicated relationship. I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of family matters." I repeated the phrase slowly. A complicated relationship. Ray let me sit with that for a moment. Then, "Harold, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to Thanksgiving," I said. He didn't like that answer, but he knew me well enough not to push. What I didn't tell Ray, what I hadn't told anyone, was that Pastor Jim Neely would also be at that table. Jim and I had been friends since we were 19. He'd officiated Margaret's funeral. He knew things about me that even Ray didn't know. And he was going to be sitting in that living room because Brittany had invited him herself, sometime in the previous month. She'd mentioned it in passing to Kyle, who mentioned it to me. She thought it would be nice to have him, she said. He gave the gathering a sense of warmth and community. What she didn't know, couldn't have known was that Jim had been to my house for dinner 3 times in the past year, that he'd heard every chapter of this story. She had arranged her own witness without realizing what she was doing. The morning of Thanksgiving, I laid my clothes out on the bed. A charcoal gray suit, not new, bought 12 years ago for a conference, worn maybe a dozen times since. Margaret had run her hand down the lapel the first time I put it on and said, "You look like the kind of man people trust." I'd never had a better reason to wear it. I called Kyle at 8:30. "I'll be there at 2, son." "Okay, Dad." His voice was careful in the way that meant there was someone else in the room. I drove out slowly. November sky, flat and white. The oak trees along Route 9 had dropped most of their leaves, and the branches were bare and exact against the pale light. I parked in front of the house and sat for a moment. I'd bought this lot in the fall of 2010, paid cash for the renovations over 2 years, replaced the kitchen cabinets myself one summer, Kyle handing me screws at the age of 20, both of us sunburned and tired and happy in a way that didn't need explaining. I'd carried Margaret across that threshold once, as a joke, when the renovation was finally done. She'd laughed the whole way. 14 people would be inside today. Ray and Carol, Pastor Jim, Diane Holloway, 2 couples, friends of Brittany's, whose names I'd heard but never matched to faces. Kyle, the baby, me, and Brittany, who had sent a text invitation to the man whose name was on the deed, to have Thanksgiving in a house she'd decided was already hers. I got out of the car. I straightened my jacket. I built this house into a home. I just never imagined I'd have to decide whether to take it back. Before I walk you through that dinner, I want to stop for just a second. If you've ever sat in someone else's version of your own life, smiling across a table that used to be yours, you already know what I felt walking up that front path. That particular kind of quiet that costs you something every time you keep it. If this is landing close to home, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed quiet too long because you love someone too much to push back? I read every single one. Now let me take you inside. She opened the door before I could knock. "Harold, glad you could make it." The way she said it, pleasantly, with a slight tilt of the head, was the way you greet a neighbor you've invited out of courtesy and don't particularly expect to enjoy. I handed her the bottle of wine I'd brought. She glanced at the label, set it on the entry table, and turned back toward the noise of the house. "Thank you for having me," I said. She was already walking. The house smelled like roasting turkey and something with cinnamon and brown sugar. 14 people in a space built for 6 made it warm, almost close. Children's voices came from somewhere upstairs. Brittany's friends had brought kids who were old enough to find their own entertainment. The low overlap of adult conversations drifted from the kitchen and the living room together. I found Ray and Carol near the fireplace. Ray put a hand on my shoulder without saying anything. Carol handed me a glass of sparkling water and gave me the look she'd been giving me for 40 years when she wanted me to know she was paying attention. My seat was at the far end of the long table, close to the baby's portable crib in the corner near the hallway. Fine with me. The baby was asleep, face slack and flushed, one fist curled under his chin the way he'd had it the very first day I held him. I watched him breathe for a while. That was the best part of the whole meal. Brittany ran the dinner like a production. She moved between the kitchen and the table and 3 separate conversations with the kind of practiced ease that makes everyone around her feel slightly behind. Her friends from work, a couple named the Prestons, another named the Garcias, laughed on cue and offered the right compliments about the food. Diane sat to Brittany's right and passed dishes with the quiet satisfaction of a deputy who's been in the room long enough to feel she co-owns it. Pastor Jim found me after the main course. We settled into the corner near the hallway for a few minutes, talking about a trail along the ridge that we'd both been meaning to walk before the real cold came in. He was easy company, Jim. The kind of man who made you feel like you had more time than you actually did. I noticed Brittany register that exchange from across the room. Just a flicker. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A small calculation being run and stored. She hadn't known Jim and I were close. I could see the moment she factored that in. Kyle sat across from me at the far end of the table. He cut his turkey into precise quarters. He did not meet my eyes once during the entire meal. I ate everything on my plate and asked no one for anything. The afternoon was going fine, which I knew enough not to trust. The dishes were cleared by 6 o'clock, the table shrank, the coats came off chairs, and everyone settled into the living room with their drinks. The afternoon had gone well, uneventfully, which in that family was the same thing. I was standing near the bookshelf with Ray, talking about nothing in particular, when I heard Brittany's voice shift key. It was subtle, the way a song changes when someone starts playing a different chord underneath. "It must be nice," she said, loudly enough to carry, "to just show up at holidays and not have to do any of the work." She was facing her friends, but the angle was deliberate. Diane smiled beside her. I kept talking to Ray. A minute passed. Then, "Kyle does everything around here. I just wish we had a little more support from, the family side." One of her friends nodded with practiced sympathy. "It really does fall on the couple," she agreed. Ray's jaw tightened. He looked at me. I put my hand flat on the bookshelf beside me, kept it there. Brittany refilled her wine. Her voice was bright now, almost festive. She'd been doing this long enough to know that my silence was permission in her model of the world. Every time I'd gone quiet in the past 3 years, she'd moved one step further. I'd been training her without meaning to. She set down the bottle, walked to the center of the room. Jim was in the armchair to my left. He placed his coffee mug on the side table with deliberate care. I didn't look at him. I looked at Brittany. She was standing where she could see everyone, and everyone could see her. The room hadn't caught up yet to what was about to happen, but I had. She looked at me, then she said it. "You know what, Harold? You're the person everyone hates. How does that feel?" For one full second, the room was completely silent. The kind of silence that happens after a sound that everyone heard and no one is sure was real. One of Brittany's friends had been mid-sentence about something to do with a holiday flight. She stopped speaking and didn't start again. I watched 3 things happen at once. Diane's eyes dropped to her glass. Kyle's face went the color of chalk. Pastor Jim set his hand flat on his knee. Brittany stood in the middle of the room with her wine glass and her 3 years of practiced certainty. And she looked at me with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a very long time to say a thing out loud, and has finally said it. I placed my glass on the coffee table in front of me. The sound it made, that small, clean contact with the wood, was the only sound in the room. I stood up, not fast, not with theater. Just the way a man stands up when he has something to say and has decided the time has come to say it. I straightened my jacket. I looked at her. "Brittany, let me ask you something." She lifted her chin. Her eyes were bright with it, the certainty that she'd finally crossed a line I couldn't come back from, that the room would see me either collapse or explode, and either way, she won. "How would you feel if you found out, today, that you were homeless?" The brightness behind her eyes shifted. "What is that supposed to mean?" "This house," I said, "the one you're standing in right now. It is not Kyle's house. It is not your house. It has never been your house. My name is on the deed. It has been since the day I paid it off, 11 years ago. There is no lease. There is no agreement. There is only my generosity, which you just finished testing." The room did not move. One of the Preston children ran across the floor upstairs. The sound of small feet was the only thing happening anywhere. Brittany's mouth opened, closed. Jim's head lowered slowly, the way a man nods when something he already knew has finally been said in front of witnesses. Ray looked at Brittany. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Ray had been waiting 3 years for this room, and he was going to let it do its work. Diane Holloway was looking at her daughter with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something between alarm and calculation. "I didn't come here to fight," I said, "but I will not sit at my own table and be told I am hated." I let that sit. Then I went to find my jacket. No one moved for a long moment after that. The word deed was still in the air. You could feel people doing the math, running back through 3 years of dinner invitations and holiday hosting, and the casual way Brittany had described repainting the back bedroom and the deck renovation she was planning for spring, and arriving, one by one, at the same uncomfortable answer. Then Kyle stood up. It was the first time all evening he'd risen before being asked to help with something. He stood like a man coming up out of water. Not surprised exactly, but surfacing. "Britt." His voice was quiet, very careful. "Did you know about the house?" She turned toward him. The confidence she'd carried into the middle of the room had started to reorganize itself into something defensive. "Of course I knew it was his house. That doesn't change. Did you know we had no claim to it? That if he'd wanted us out, we'd have had to leave?" "That's not the point. Then what is?" Brittany looked around the room. One of her friends had set her wine glass on the mantel and crossed her arms. the way you do when you're deciding you'd rather be uninvolved. The other couple had gone very still. Diane's expression had curdled into something between alarm and the particular resentment of a woman who realizes the story her daughter told her may have been missing several chapters. No one moved toward Brittany. "Now, everyone just calm down," Diane started. Ray said, gently and precisely, "Diane, I think this is between Harold and his son." She closed her mouth. Ray had that quality. He could say a thing so reasonably that refusing it made you look unreasonable. I picked up my jacket from the chair where I'd left it 2 hours before, the charcoal gray suit, Margaret's suit. I put it on, button by button, in the quiet. No one spoke while I did this. The act of buttoning a jacket can carry a great deal when a room is paying attention. At the door, I stopped. Kyle was still standing in the middle of the room. He had his mother's jawline and a look on his face I hadn't seen in 3 years. Not anger, not embarrassment, recognition. The specific expression of someone understanding something they should have understood much earlier. "Call me when you're ready, son." I opened the front door. The November air came in cold and direct. I stepped out and pulled the door closed behind me, softly. The way you close a door when you want someone to hear that there's no anger left in it, just a finished thing. From inside, a moment later, I heard my grandson begin to cry. The solid, clear cry of a baby waking up with no agenda, just the simple announcement that he was there. I walked to my car. No one came out after me. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The house behind me glowed with all its windows lit. Inside, a version of something was either ending or changing shape into the thing it would eventually have to become. I drove home. I want to step out of this story for just a moment. I left that house not knowing what would happen next. Part of me was ready for the worst, for Kyle to choose silence again, for the whole thing to harden into something permanent and cold. But there is something that happens when you finally say a true thing in a room full of people. It doesn't disappear. It just sits there, and everyone has to decide what to do with it. If you've ever had a moment like that, where you said the thing you'd been holding for years, tell me in the comments. I read every one. Now let me tell you what happened in the days after I drove home. 3 days went by. No call from Kyle. No text. I didn't reach out either. I'd said what I had to say. The next move wasn't mine, and I knew it. And I sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a decision you're certain of and still uncomfortable making. I watered the plants on the back porch. Read 2 chapters of a book I'd been meaning to finish since spring. Made soup from scratch on Saturday. A chicken vegetable. The recipe Margaret had written on an index card that I'd memorized so thoroughly I didn't need to look at it anymore. But I got the card out anyway and set it on the counter while I cooked, the way I always had. Ray called Friday morning. He told me Diane Holloway had been busy. Calls to extended family on both sides. A version of Thanksgiving that positioned the whole evening as Harold's unprovoked attack on a daughter-in-law who had done nothing but work herself to exhaustion, hosting a holiday for 14 people. "What did you tell people?" I asked. "That I was there," Ray said, "and that I have 2 working ears." I appreciated that about my brother. He had never in his life complicated the truth by adding to it. On Saturday, a message arrived through a social media platform I barely used, from a woman I'd never met, one of Brittany's friends from the dinner. The message was several paragraphs long, and the first sentence was enough to tell me I didn't need the rest. I blocked the account and went back to my soup. I want to say it didn't affect me. It did, a little. Not because of what the woman said. She hadn't been at the hospital, hadn't heard about the barbecue photographs, had no idea what the past 3 years had actually looked like, but because it meant Brittany had been on the phone inside of 48 hours, building her case with the tools available to her. That took a certain kind of energy. I found it, briefly, exhausting to think about. That night I didn't sleep well. Not from regret, not from anger, from something quieter and harder to name. The specific worry of a father who has done the necessary thing and doesn't yet know what it cost. I'd meant every word I said. I didn't regret it. I only regretted that it had to be said at all. That we had arrived at a Thanksgiving table where the truth needed to be said, in that room, in front of those people, with those stakes attached. Sunday came and went without a word from Kyle. In the evening, I sat in the chair that faced the front yard, the one Margaret used to read in, and watched the last of the November light go thin and gray over the oak tree she'd planted the year we moved in. It was 30 feet tall now. She never saw it get that high. On Monday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. He looked like he hadn't slept right in 3 days. I opened the door and stepped to one side. He came in without a word, the way he used to come in from school on the hard days, when something had gone wrong and he didn't yet have language for it. When he was 12 and a friend said something cruel at recess. When he was 17 and the girl he'd liked chose someone else. He'd always come to this kitchen the same way, quietly, with his coat still on, needing a moment before he could speak. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one we'd been sitting at his whole life. The surface had a chip near the right corner from the summer he turned 8 and decided to see what happened if he hit it with a hammer. The hammer left a mark. We'd never fixed it. It was just part of the table. I didn't ask him to explain. I plugged in the kettle and got out 2 mugs, the same pair Margaret had bought at a market in Vermont 20-some years back. Heavy ceramic, blue glaze. I'd replaced nearly everything else in the kitchen after she died. Never replaced the mugs. He spoke first. Dad, I've been thinking about a lot of things. Okay. I don't know how I let it get this far. I put the mugs down and sat across from him. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't choose the version of the truth that would protect him. I told him what the past 3 years had actually looked like from where I was standing. The birthday cookout I found out about through photographs. The 12 minutes in the hospital room while Diane sat in the good chair. The woman from church in the parking lot saying the word intense with careful pity. The Sunday calls that had gotten shorter and shorter until they were mostly just me saying fine and meaning it less each time. I wasn't angry when I said these things. I was just accurate. There's a difference, and I think he could hear it. Kyle listened without interrupting. He watched me the way I used to watch him when he was little and working through a math problem, with concentration, not defense. When I was done, he sat with it for a moment. Why didn't you say something sooner, Dad? Because I kept thinking you'd find your way back on your own. He nodded slowly. And if I hadn't? I thought about that honestly before answering. I'd have been lonelier than I care to say, and I'd have kept the house. He almost smiled, then it faded. He looked at the chip in the corner of the table. Dad, I'm sorry. I know, son, I know. We sat there while the coffee cooled between us. We didn't fix everything that morning. There was too much of it, and Kyle still had to go home to a conversation I couldn't have for him. But we found the place to start from. That was enough. For that Monday morning, it was exactly enough. A week after Kyle's visit, I called Paul Strickland again. We talked through the options. There was no anger in it, no score settling, just the practical matter of what a fair arrangement looked like, now that everything was on the table. Paul was straightforward, the way he'd always been. I sent Kyle and Brittany a formal letter the following Friday, written plainly. They had 60 days to either sign a lease at current market rate, which I had appraised at $1,800 a month, or make arrangements to find alternate housing. I included Paul's contact information if they had questions. The letter was not a punishment. It was a description of reality. We had been operating in fiction for 3 years, and I was done pretending the fiction was fine. Brittany's response came by text 2 days later. The language was scorched. Accusations of retaliation, of cruelty, of a father who'd never accepted her. I read it once, put the phone face down, and did not reply. It took Kyle another 10 days to call me. When he did, his voice was tired in a way I recognized. The exhaustion of a man who has been arguing with himself more than with anyone else. We'll sign the lease, Dad. Okay. I want you to know, this isn't how I wanted things to go. I know that, son. The lease was signed the last week of December. I took the monthly rent payments and put them directly into a scholarship fund through the local community college, named for Margaret. I didn't tell Kyle where the money was going at first. When I did tell him, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She would have liked that." "Yes," I said, "she would have." 3 weeks into the new year, Kyle called on a Sunday morning and told me what Brittany had said. She'd drawn the line clearly. Him or Harold. His father or their marriage. She framed it as a reasonable request from a woman who had been humiliated in her own home. Except it wasn't her home. And what had happened at Thanksgiving hadn't been humiliation so much as consequence. But I kept that thought to myself, because Kyle hadn't called me to ask for my analysis. He'd called to tell me his answer. I said no, Kyle told me. I told her he's my father. I'm not cutting him out. I sat down at the kitchen table. I hadn't expected that. Or maybe I'd hoped for it for so long that I'd stopped letting myself expect it. How did she take that? I asked. Not well. Are you two going to be all right? He was quiet for a moment. We're seeing someone, a counselor. I don't know how it'll go. That was honest. More honest than Kyle had been with me in years, and I told him so. I didn't raise my son to choose me. I raised him, the way Margaret and I both tried to know the difference between love and control. For 3 years, I'd watched that distinction get blurred until I wasn't sure he could see it anymore. He saw it now. What happened between Kyle and Brittany after that wasn't mine to manage or predict. Some things you hand back to the people they belong to, and you trust that enough light has come in to make a difference. I hoped it had. Kyle called again the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By February, I'd gotten back the habit of Fridays. Ray and Carol came to dinner every Friday evening, the way we'd done it when we were kids at our parents' table, the way we'd done it for years before Margaret got sick and the rhythm of everything changed. Carol brought bread, Ray brought stories about things that didn't matter and mattered enormously. I made whatever was in the refrigerator, which turned out to be enough. The house felt different in ways I had to think carefully about before I could name them. Then I figured it out. It felt like mine again. It had always been mine, legally, technically. But there's a difference between owning a thing and feeling like you belong in it. Somewhere over the past 3 years, I'd started adjusting my behavior in my own kitchen, in my own living room. Leaving earlier than I wanted to, saying less than I thought, editing myself down into something that took up less space and demanded less of anyone. I stopped doing that, mostly without noticing. Kyle started bringing the baby over on Saturday afternoons, just the two of them most weeks. Brittany and Kyle were still in counseling, and the structure of the weekends had been renegotiated into something functional, if not exactly warm. The baby was almost a year old now, and had discovered that walking toward things was more interesting than being carried. He moved through my kitchen like a small, extremely determined explorer, cataloging every low shelf and cabinet pole as items of significant scientific interest. I put Margaret's photograph back on the kitchen shelf. I had taken it down 2 years into Kyle's marriage. Brittany had looked at it once, with a kind of appraising silence I hadn't liked, and I'd made the small accommodation without admitting to myself what I was doing. Told myself I was being considerate. That was not quite the full truth of it. I put it back on a Tuesday in January. Margaret, in her garden, summer light, squinting slightly into the sun. She was 44 in that photo. She had no idea what was coming and looked completely at peace, which is exactly how she moved through her life and exactly how she left it. I don't know what happens between Kyle and Brittany in the long run. I genuinely don't. Some things mend. Some things reach a functional arrangement both people can live inside. Some things end quietly. That's their story, and they're the only ones who can write it. But on Saturday afternoons, my grandson points at the birds outside my window like they are the most remarkable things he has ever encountered in his brief year on Earth. I sit beside him on the floor, and I agree. People ask me whether I regret waiting as long as I did. Honestly, I'm not sure. Part of me thinks that if I'd said something 2 years earlier, Kyle would have defended her, and the whole thing would have just calcified faster. Part of me thinks 3 years of silence was a form of enabling that I convinced myself was grace. I still don't have a clean answer on that one. What I do know is this: keeping quiet is not the same as being weak. There are real reasons a person stays silent. Love, hope, the particular terror of damaging something you can't repair. I stayed quiet because I loved my son. That was true, and it was mine, and I don't apologize for it. But there comes a point when your silence stops protecting the people you love and starts protecting the people who are hurting them. That point for me was Thanksgiving. I didn't plan what I said. I didn't rehearse it. I didn't walk in with a strategy. I walked in with a fact I had never used, and I used it only because someone decided, in front of 14 people, in a house with my name on the deed, to tell me I was hated. I put my glass down, I stood up, and I asked one question. The rest, the lease, the boundary, the long Sunday calls with Kyle, came after. Not because I planned any of it, because once the truth is in the room, everything else has to arrange itself around it. That's what I keep coming back to. The truth was always there. It just took her saying that one thing for me to finally let it be known. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Harold did the right thing? Waiting that long before speaking up? Or should he have said something sooner? Leave your answer in the comments. There's no wrong answer, and I read every one of them. If this story stayed with you, there's another one in the description below that I think you'll want to hear next. Same kind of stakes, same kind of quiet that finally runs out. Thank you for being here with me tonight.